The blood on my kitchen floor had long since dried, but the memory remained fresh as yesterday's wound. I sat in Detective Marcus Coleman's cramped office, my hands folded perfectly in my lap, watching him lean back in his chair with the casual indifference of a man who'd already made up his mind. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Mrs. Richardson, he said, not bothering to look up from the file he was pretending to read. I understand you're upset, but the evidence just isn't there. Evidence. The word tasted bitter in my mouth. I thought about the shattered vase, the bruises I'd photographed on my ribs, the threatening voicemails I'd saved, all dismissed with the wave of his manicured hand. Detective Coleman, I said quietly, my husband threatened to kill me. I have recordings. Domestic disputes can get heated, he replied, finally meeting my eyes with a patronizing smile. Eric's a good man. Been friends with him since high school? Sometimes couples just need to work things out. Friends since high school. That explained everything and nothing all at once. I watched Marcus tap his pen against the desk, the same rhythm Eric used when he was deciding which part of me to hurt next. The resemblance between the two men went beyond their shared history. Both possessed that particular brand of arrogance that came from never being told no. The case is closed. Mrs. Richardson, I suggest marriage counseling. I stood slowly, smoothing my conservative navy dress. Thank you for your time, Detective. As I walked through the police station, I felt their eyes following me. The pitying glances from female officers who couldn't help. The dismissive looks from male officers who saw me as another hysterical wife. None of them knew who I really was. None of them realized they'd just made the biggest mistake of their careers. My name is Catherine Richardson, but that's only been true for the past 3 years. Before that, before Eric, before this carefully constructed suburban nightmare, I was Catherine Morrison, Senior Policy Advisor to the President of the United States. The woman who crafted the domestic violence legislation that quadrupled federal funding for victim services. The architect of the law enforcement accountability measures that were supposed to prevent exactly this kind of corruption. I'd met Eric at a charity gala in Georgetown, back when I was still navigating the treacherous waters of Washington politics. He'd seemed different from the usual crowd, genuine, uncomplicated, refreshingly normal. A successful contractor from a small town in Virginia, building a life with his hands instead of manipulation and backroom deals. What I hadn't known was that Eric Richardson collected beautiful, successful women the way some men collected vintage cars. He displayed us, controlled us, and when we stopped serving his purpose, he destroyed us. I was just the latest model in his garage. The decision to step away from politics had been mine, or so I'd thought at the time. Eric had been so understanding about the pressure I faced, so supportive when the 16-hour days started taking their toll. He'd suggested a quieter life, maybe starting a family. Finding peace away from the chaos of D.C., I'd resigned from my position with great fanfare, moving to Millbrook, Virginia, population 12,000, to become the perfect suburban wife. The president himself had attended our wedding, though he'd had to leave early for a national security briefing. Eric had beamed with pride that day, not knowing he was marrying a woman who held more real power in her pinky finger than he'd ever possess in his entire life. But that was before. Before the first accident, where I'd supposedly walked into a door. Before the isolation from friends and former colleagues. Before Eric revealed his true nature, piece by calculated piece. Now, walking to my car in the police station parking lot, I pulled out a phone Marcus Coleman didn't know existed. A secure line that connected directly to people who could make problems disappear or appear depending on their mood. Catherine? The voice that answered belonged to David Chen, Deputy Chief of Staff and one of the few people who knew my real situation. Are you safe? For now, I replied, sliding into my sedan. But we need to talk. Tonight. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The drive home took 22 minutes through tree-lined streets that might have been charming if they hadn't become my prison. Millbrook looked like something from a Norman Rockwell painting. White picket fences, manicured lawns, the kind of community where everyone knew everyone, and secrets were currency. Eric's truck wasn't in the driveway when I arrived, which meant he was either at the construction site or the bar with his friends. Probably the latter, celebrating another successful intimidation campaign with Detective Coleman and their other high school buddies, who'd never quite grown up. I let myself into the house we'd bought with my money but put in his name. Another red flag I'd ignored in my eagerness to build something real. The kitchen still smelled faintly of the industrial cleaner I'd used to scrub away the evidence of our last disagreement. Walking upstairs to what Eric thought was just my craft room, I pressed my palm against a seemingly decorative panel. The wall slid open silently, revealing my real office, a space even the most thorough home search wouldn't uncover. 3 monitors sprang to life, connecting me to a world Eric couldn't imagine. Encrypted communications with congressional leaders, real-time briefings from federal agencies, and most importantly, access to databases that could unravel lives or build them back stronger than before. My fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up everything I could find on Detective Marcus Coleman. His military service record, honorable discharge but several disciplinary actions for excessive force. His police file, complaints buried, promotions inexplicably fast-tracked. His financial records, interesting. Very interesting. The offshore account in the Cayman Islands caught my attention first. Regular deposits that didn't match his police salary, all traced back to shell companies with interesting connections. I cross-referenced the dates with closed cases, finding a pattern that would make any federal prosecutor salivate. But Marcus was small fish. The real problem was systemic, and I'd need to be strategic about how I handled this. One wrong move and Eric would disappear, probably taking evidence with him. Another victim, another unsolved case. My secure phone buzzed. David's name appeared on the screen along with a location: Fairmont Hotel, Arlington. Room 1247. I glanced at my watch. Eric wouldn't be home for hours, and I had work to do. The drive to Arlington gave me time to think, to plan. 3 years of pretending to be helpless had nearly convinced me I actually was. But sitting behind the wheel of my sedan, I felt the old confidence returning. The woman who had negotiated with foreign diplomats and authored legislation that affected millions was still in here, buried beneath the carefully constructed facade of suburban vulnerability. Room 1247 was a suite I'd used before for sensitive meetings. David answered the door immediately, his usually perfect hair slightly disheveled with worry. "Catherine, what happened?" "Your message was cryptic, but you sounded angry," I finished, settling into one of the plush armchairs. "I'm very angry, David." Over the next hour, I laid out everything. Eric's escalating abuse, the police department's corruption, Detective Coleman's obvious bias. David listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a tablet that would automatically encrypt and destroy its contents. "Jesus, Catherine. Why didn't you reach out sooner?" "Because I thought I could handle it through normal channels," I admitted. "I wanted to believe the system would work the way we designed it to work." David leaned forward, his expression serious. "The president doesn't know about your situation, does he?" "No, and I'd prefer to keep it that way unless absolutely necessary." I pulled up the files I'd compiled on my phone. "But I think we're past the point of quiet solutions." David studied the financial records, his eyebrows rising with each discovery. "Coleman's been busy. These payments trace back to a network we've been investigating. Private security contractors who specialize in making problems go away for wealthy clients." "Eric's not wealthy," I pointed out. "No, but his family has connections. His uncle, Robert Richardson. Ever heard of him?" The name sent a chill through me. Robert Richardson was a real estate mogul with interests spanning from Virginia to Florida, the kind of man who collected politicians like poker chips. More importantly, he was someone who'd opposed every piece of domestic violence legislation I'd ever written. "Eric's been keeping that connection quiet," I murmured, pieces falling into place. "His uncle probably sees me as a long-term threat, even in retirement. Gets worse, David said, scrolling through his own files. Richardson Development has contracts with the Defense Department. If this becomes public, if it comes out that his nephew was protected by a corrupt police department while abusing a former presidential advisor, the administration takes a hit, I finished, and Robert Richardson loses millions in government contracts. We sat in silence for a moment, the implications settling between us like a heavy fog. This wasn't just about Eric's violence or Marcus Coleman's corruption. This was about powerful men protecting their interests at the expense of everything I'd spent years trying to build. "What do you need?" David asked finally. "Access," I replied. "Full access to the federal databases, financial crimes, organized crime task force files, everything." "Catherine, you know I can't just—" "David." I looked him straight in the eye. "How many women have died while I've been playing house in Millbrook? How many cases has Coleman buried? How many other victims are out there because men like Robert Richardson think they can buy their way out of consequences?" He was quiet for a long moment, then pulled out his own secure phone. "I'll have full access restored within the hour. Backdated authorization, completely legitimate. And operational support?" "What kind of operational support?" I smiled for the first time in weeks. The kind that reminds people why I was considered the most dangerous woman in Washington. The ride back to Millbrook was different this time. Instead of feeling like a victim returning to her cage, I felt like a predator returning to hunting grounds that had suddenly become much more interesting. Eric's truck was in the driveway when I arrived, engine still ticking as it cooled. Through the kitchen window I could see him at the table with a beer, probably wondering where his obedient wife had disappeared to. I entered through the front door, hanging my purse on the hook by the entrance with deliberate normalcy. "Where were you?" Eric's voice carried that edge I'd learned to recognize. The precursor to violence. "Shopping," I lied smoothly, holding up a bag from the grocery store I'd stopped at on the way home. "We were out of your favorite beer." The tension in his shoulders eased slightly. Eric's violence was always worse when he felt his control slipping, and routine grocery shopping was safely domestic, properly submissive. "Get me another one," he said, not looking up from his phone. As I opened the refrigerator, my secure phone vibrated once against my hip. Access granted. I had my weapons back. "Did you talk to Marcus today?" Eric asked casually, but I caught the sharp interest in his voice. "Yes." He was very helpful. I placed the beer in front of him, noting how his grip tightened on his first bottle. He explained that sometimes couples just need to work things out. Eric's smile was predatory. "Marcus is a smart man. Always has been." "I'm sure he is." I moved around the kitchen, preparing dinner with the same mechanical precision I'd perfected over 3 years of marriage. But my mind was elsewhere, planning, calculating. Eric and his friends thought they'd won, that they'd successfully cowed another victim into submission. They had no idea they'd just declared war on someone who'd spent years learning to fight battles they couldn't even comprehend. As Eric scrolled through his phone, probably texting Marcus Coleman about his successful intimidation, I began composing my own messages. Encrypted communications to federal agents who owed me favors, to prosecutors who understood that some cases were worth the risk, to investigators who specialized in taking down corrupt networks. "Cat," Eric said suddenly, using the nickname that had once seemed affectionate but now felt like ownership. "Come here." I approached cautiously, recognizing the tone. His hand shot out, gripping my wrist hard enough to leave marks. "You understand how things work now, right?" His thumb pressed against the pulse point on my wrist, a reminder of how easily he could cut off my circulation. "You understand that some fights aren't worth fighting?" "I understand," I said quietly. But what I understood wasn't surrender. I understood that Eric Richardson had made the mistake of thinking he was dealing with a typical victim. He understood that Detective Marcus Coleman had just corrupted a federal investigation without realizing it. I understood that Robert Richardson's network of protection was about to become the very thing that destroyed them all. Eric released my wrist, satisfied with my apparent compliance. "Good girl. Now finish dinner." "I'm hungry." As I returned to the stove, my reflection in the kitchen window caught my eye. For 3 years, that woman had looked defeated, broken, afraid. Tonight, for the first time since I'd said "I do" to Eric Richardson, she looked like someone who was about to remind the world exactly who she used to be and who she still was. Underneath it all, my secure phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from someone whose name Eric Richardson would recognize even if he'd never understand its significance. Resources authorized. Operation approved. Welcome back, Catherine. The sender was listed simply as POTUS. I smiled as I stirred the pasta sauce, thinking about tomorrow's chess moves. Eric and Marcus and Robert Richardson had been playing checkers, thinking they were clever. They had no idea the game had just changed to something infinitely more complex, but they would learn. After all, I had been very patient for 3 years. I'd played the perfect victim, the ideal suburban wife, the woman who knew her place. Tomorrow I would start playing myself again, and unlike Eric's victims, I had resources they couldn't imagine, allies they'd never seen coming, and a level of knowledge about their own crimes that would terrify them if they knew. The pasta water began to boil, and I watched the bubbles rise to the surface with the satisfaction of someone who knew that some storms took time to build. But when they finally broke, they changed everything in their path. Eric had wanted a perfect victim. Instead, he'd married the one woman in America who had the power to ensure that perfect victims got perfect justice. The game was about to begin. Dawn broke over Millbrook with the kind of crisp clarity that made everything seem possible. I stood at my kitchen window watching Eric's truck disappear down Maple Street, heading to what he thought would be another ordinary day of intimidating subcontractors and celebrating his victory over his troublesome wife. He had no idea that at 6:47 a.m., federal agents in 3 different states had simultaneously begun executing search warrants. My secure phone displayed a series of brief messages. Richmond PD Internal Affairs, assets secured. Norfolk, Financial Crimes Division, documents obtained. DC Metropolitan, subject in custody. Each notification represented months of careful investigation finally bearing fruit. The coffee maker gurgled to life as I reviewed the overnight intelligence reports David had forwarded. Detective Marcus Coleman's financial crimes were more extensive than even I had suspected. The man who'd dismissed my case yesterday was currently facing a dawn raid on his investment portfolio, his offshore accounts, and his private safety deposit box. But Coleman was just the appetizer. The main course was already in motion. At exactly 8:15 a.m., my doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I could see a woman in a conservative gray suit holding federal credentials. Special Agent Rebecca Martinez from the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, someone I'd worked with extensively on anti-corruption legislation. "Mrs. Richardson," she said when I opened the door, "I apologize for the early hour, but we need to discuss your recent interactions with Detective Coleman." I invited her in, playing the role of the confused suburban housewife one last time. Is something wrong? He seemed like such a nice man. Agent Martinez settled into my living room, her trained eyes cataloging details. "We have reason to believe Detective Coleman may have been compromised in his handling of your case. We'd like your cooperation in a federal investigation." "Of course," I replied, pouring coffee with hands that trembled just enough to seem authentic. "But I'm not sure what I can tell you that would be helpful." For the next hour, I walked Agent Martinez through my experiences with the Millbrook Police Department, carefully omitting any mention of my real identity or resources. Every detail I provided had already been corroborated by surveillance footage, financial records, and communications intercepts her team had gathered. "Mrs. Richardson," she said finally, "would you be willing to wear a recording device if Detective Coleman contacts you again?" "A recording device?" I let my voice climb slightly. Perfect suburban fear. "That sounds dangerous. We understand your concerns, but you may be our best chance of exposing a corruption network that's been operating for years." I pretended to consider this, letting appropriate anxiety show on my face. "What kind of protection would you provide?" "Full federal witness protection if necessary. This case has the highest priority clearance." "Highest priority clearance," That meant the authorization had come from the very top, probably triggered by keywords in Coleman's database that connected to ongoing national security investigations. The president's signature on last night's operational approval had guaranteed that every agency would treat this as critical infrastructure protection. "I'll do it," I said, mustering what I hoped looked like desperate courage. "If it helps other women." Agent Martinez smiled with genuine warmth. "You're very brave, Mrs. Richardson. If only she knew." As soon as Martinez left, I activated my secure communications array. The morning's operations had proceeded flawlessly, but the real challenge was about to begin. Eric would be getting phone calls within the hour, panicked messages from friends who were discovering their world crumbling around them. My phone rang. Eric's number. "Kat, what the hell is going on?" His voice carried an edge of panic I'd never heard before. "Marcus just called me, said federal agents raided his house this morning." "Federal agents?" I made my voice climb appropriately. "Eric, what's happening?" "I don't know, but I'm coming home. Don't talk to anyone until I get there." The line went dead. I smiled, checking the tactical display on my secure monitor. Eric's truck was already speeding toward our house, probably breaking every traffic law in his desperation. He'd arrive in 18 minutes, giving me just enough time to prepare the next phase. I retrieved the recording device Agent Martinez had provided, a sophisticated piece of equipment that would capture everything while appearing innocuous. But I also activated my own recording systems, the ones Eric would never think to look for. His truck screeched into the driveway at 10:43 a.m. Through the window, I watched him stride toward the house, his usual swagger replaced by barely controlled desperation. The front door slammed against the wall as he burst inside. "Kat, where are you?" "Here," I called from the kitchen, injecting just the right amount of fear into my voice. Eric appeared in the doorway, his face flushed with exertion and panic. "Did anyone come here this morning? Police, federal agents, anyone?" "Just that nice woman from the FBI, I said, stirring my coffee with deliberately casual indifference. Eric's face went white. "FBI? What FBI woman?" "Agent Martinez. She said Detective Coleman might have made some mistakes with my case." I looked up at him with perfect innocence. "She asked me to help them understand what happened." "What did you tell her?" Eric's hands were clenched into fists, and I could see the calculation in his eyes. He was deciding whether intimidation or charm would be more effective. Just what happened at the police station. About Detective Coleman dismissing my complaints? I paused, letting my voice take on a confused tone. "Eric, why would federal agents be interested in a simple domestic dispute?" The question hung between us like a loaded weapon. Eric's mouth opened and closed several times before he managed to speak. "It's nothing. Probably some bureaucratic mix-up." But his voice lacked its usual confidence. "What else did this agent want?" She asked if I'd wear a recording device if Detective Coleman contacted me again. I told her I'd think about it. Eric's expression shifted from panic to calculation to cold fury in the space of seconds. "You're not wearing any recording device. You're not talking to any more federal agents. This is just some misunderstanding that will blow over." "But what if it doesn't?" I pressed, allowing desperation to creep into my voice. "What if Detective Coleman really did something wrong? What if this affects you somehow?" "It won't affect me because I didn't do anything wrong," Eric snapped, but his defensive tone suggested otherwise. My secure phone buzzed against my hip. A message from Agent Martinez. "Subject's financial records show payments from Richardson Development Corp. Recommend immediate escalation." Perfect timing. "Eric," I said quietly. "There's something else Agent Martinez mentioned. She said Detective Coleman received payments from someone called Richardson Development. Isn't that your uncle's company?" The color drained from Eric's face completely. For a moment, I thought he might actually faint. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "How would you know about Uncle Robert's business?" "I don't," I replied with perfect honesty. But the FBI agent seemed very interested in the connection. Eric began pacing the kitchen like a caged animal, running his hands through his hair. "This is impossible. Uncle Robert doesn't have anything to do with the police department." "Then why would Detective Coleman be receiving payments from his company?" He wouldn't. There's no reason for— Eric stopped mid-sentence, realization dawning on his face. Unless what? Eric's phone rang, interrupting the conversation. The display showed Uncle Robert. Eric stared at it for 3 rings before answering. Hello. Uncle Robert, even from across the kitchen. I could hear Robert Richardson's voice through the phone, loud with barely controlled fury. Eric's face grew paler with each word, his responses reduced to increasingly weak, yes, sir, and no, sir, replies. When the call ended, Eric looked like a man who'd just received his death sentence. What did he say? I asked gently. He said— Eric swallowed hard. He said federal agents raided 3 of his properties this morning. They're looking for evidence of corruption, bribery, obstruction of justice. He thinks it's connected to your case somehow. I widened my eyes appropriately. My case, but I just reported some threats. How could that lead to— I don't know. Eric exploded, his composure finally cracking completely. But somehow it has. And now Uncle Robert is talking about cut-off funding, distancing himself from the family, protecting his business interests. The implications were clearly sinking in for Eric. Without his uncle's financial support, the construction business would fail. Without the protection Robert's influence provided, Eric would be just another small-town contractor with a history of domestic violence. Maybe, I said carefully, we should cooperate with the FBI, show them we have nothing to hide. Eric's laugh was bitter. Nothing to hide? Cat, there are things you don't understand about how business works in this town. What kind of things? For a moment I thought he might actually confess. The weight of his secrets was clearly crushing him, and the urge to unburden himself was written across his face. But then his survival instincts kicked in. Nothing you need to worry about, he said, attempting to regain his authoritative tone. Just let me handle this. How? I'm calling a lawyer. The best lawyer Uncle Robert's money can buy. Eric pulled out his phone again, but paused before dialing. And you're not talking to any more federal agents without me present. I nodded submissively, but my mind was already racing ahead to the next moves. Eric's panic was revealing fractures in the network I'd only suspected before. Each desperate phone call, each attempt to coordinate a response, would provide more evidence of the conspiracy. My secure phone buzzed again. This time it was David Chen. Richardson Development Contracts under federal review. Defense Department launching parallel investigation. Congressional Oversight Committee requesting briefing. The web was unraveling faster than I'd anticipated. Eric, I said, maybe you should call Detective Coleman. See if he's okay. Eric's face went even whiter. Coleman? Why would I call Coleman? Because he's your friend. Because if he's in trouble, maybe he needs help. The suggestion was perfectly innocent, exactly what a concerned wife might propose. But I could see the wheels turning in Eric's head, calculating the risks of any contact with Coleman versus the risks of appearing to abandon an ally. I can't call Marcus, he said finally. If the FBI is watching him, then they'd see you trying to help a friend in need. Wouldn't that look better than avoiding him? Eric stared at me for a long moment, and I wondered if he was finally beginning to suspect that his helpless wife might not be as helpless as she appeared. But then his phone rang again, and whatever suspicions might have been forming were overwhelmed by the immediate crisis. This time, the caller was someone named Tony Bertelson, apparently another member of their high school circle. Eric's half of the conversation consisted mainly of hushed affirmatives and increasingly creative profanity. When he hung up, Eric slumped into a kitchen chair as if his strings had been cut. Tony says the FBI seized Marcus's computer this morning. They found encrypted communications, financial records, some kind of database. Eric looked up at me with haunted eyes. Kat, I think we might need to leave town for a while. Leave town? But this is our home. Home won't matter if— Eric stopped himself, clearly realizing he was about to say too much. If what? If this investigation spreads beyond Marcus? If they start looking at everyone he's connected to? I reached across the table and took his hand, feeling him flinch at the contact. Eric, what did you do? The question hung in the air like a sword. Eric stared down at our joined hands, and for a moment his mask slipped completely. I saw the fear, the guilt, the desperate calculation of a man who'd built his life on a foundation of lies and was watching it collapse in real time. I protected my family, he said finally. I protected my business. I did what any man would do. By paying a police detective? Eric's head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock. How did you— Agent Martinez mentioned suspicious payments. I just connected the dots. I kept my voice gentle, non-accusatory. Eric, if you made some kind of arrangement with Detective Coleman, maybe we can fix this. Maybe if we cooperate— We can't fix this. Eric pulled his hand away from mine, standing abruptly. You don't understand what we're dealing with. Uncle Robert has connections everywhere, but if this becomes a federal case, then we get ahead of it, I said firmly. We tell the truth before someone else does. Eric laughed, but there was no humor in it. The truth? Kat, if I tell the truth about everything that's happened over the past 3 years, I'll spend the rest of my life in prison. The admission hit the air like a physical blow. Eric immediately realized what he'd said, his face cycling through panic, anger, and resignation. What happened over the past 3 years? I asked quietly. Eric sank back into his chair, suddenly looking decades older. Things got out of hand. Business was struggling, and Uncle Robert offered to help, but there were conditions. Arrangements that had to be made with local law enforcement. What kind of arrangements? Protection. For the business, for the family. Sometimes construction companies have problems with workers, with safety inspectors, with wives who ask too many questions. Eric met my eyes directly for the first time in the conversation. Marcus made those problems go away. Other wives? Eric nodded slowly. 3 others before you. Marcus made sure their complaints were buried, their evidence disappeared. In exchange, Uncle Robert made sure Marcus's gambling debts were covered, his mortgage payments current, his daughter's college tuition paid. The full scope of the corruption was finally becoming clear. This wasn't just about Eric's violence or Marcus Coleman's greed. This was an entire system designed to protect abusive men with the right connections, while silencing their victims. Eric, I said carefully, those other wives. What happened to them? 2 moved away, filed for divorce and disappeared. Eric's voice was barely audible. 1 had an accident. The room seemed to contract around us. What kind of accident? Car went off the road during a storm. Very tragic. Very convenient. My blood ran cold, but I forced my expression to remain neutral. And you think that might happen to me if I don't cooperate? Eric met my eyes directly. I think you're the smartest woman I've ever met. Kat, too smart for your own good sometimes. The threat was unmistakable, but so was something else in his voice. Fear, not of me, but of what he'd become, what he'd been part of. For the first time in our marriage, Eric Richardson looked like a man who understood the true cost of his choices. My secure phone vibrated again. A message from Agent Martinez. Need to accelerate timeline. New developments require immediate action. The web was unraveling faster than anyone had anticipated, and I was sitting at the center of it all, watching 3 years of careful planning finally bear fruit. But as I looked at Eric's haunted face, I realized that revenge, no matter how perfectly orchestrated, always came with consequences no one could predict. The game was accelerating beyond anyone's control, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear the approaching thunder of a storm that would change everything. The call came at 2:47 a.m., 3 days after Eric's confession about the accident. I was already awake, monitoring encrypted communications from my hidden office, watching the federal net tighten around Robert Richardson's empire. Catherine. The president's voice was unmistakable, even on the secure line. We need to meet. Sir, is that wise? The investigation just became a national security matter. Arlington Memorial Hospital, 30 minutes. Come alone. The line went dead, leaving me staring at a phone that had just changed everything. If the president was willing to meet personally, it meant the corruption network had tentacles reaching far beyond Virginia. It meant people in Washington were scared. I slipped out of the house without waking Eric, who'd been sedating himself with whiskey for 3 straight nights. His dreams had become a symphony of mumbled confessions and terror-filled whimpering. The guilt was eating him alive, which was exactly what I'd intended. The drive to Arlington took 45 minutes through empty highways. The hospital's parking garage was deserted except for a single black sedan and 2 SUVs that screamed federal protection detail. I parked 3 levels up and took the stairs, my footsteps echoing in the concrete emptiness. The president was waiting in a private conference room on the 7th floor, flanked by Secret Service agents who nodded respectfully as I entered. Even at nearly 3 a.m., he looked impeccable, a skill that came from decades of crisis management. Catherine. He stood, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming, Mr. President." I shook his hand, noting the firmness of his grip, the direct eye contact. This was the man I'd worked with for 4 years, not the distant figurehead Eric thought he'd married. The Secret Service agents withdrew to positions outside the door, leaving us alone in the sterile conference room. "Sit," he said, settling across from me. "We have approximately 20 minutes before I need to return to the White House." I took the offered chair, studying his expression. The president looked tired in a way that went beyond mere exhaustion, the bone-deep weariness of a man who'd just learned that his administration was compromised. "How bad is it?" I asked directly. "Bad enough that 3 members of Congress received mysterious campaign contributions from Richardson Development last election cycle. Bad enough that 2 federal judges are now under investigation for suspicious rulings involving Richardson properties. Bad enough that my attorney general is demanding answers I don't have." I absorbed this information, calculating implications. Robert Richardson was building more than just a local protection network, much more. The preliminary forensic accounting suggests he's been systematically purchasing influence at every level of government. Your husband's violence was just the tip of the iceberg, a test case for how effectively they could bury federal crimes. The president leaned forward, his expression grave. "Catherine, what you've uncovered isn't just about domestic abuse. It's about the systematic corruption of American justice. If this network had continued operating, they could have protected anyone from anything," I finished. "Drug dealers, human traffickers, terrorists. As long as they had the right connections and enough money." "Exactly. Which is why I'm asking you to accelerate your timeline." I raised an eyebrow. "Sir? Tomorrow morning, you're going to walk into the Millbrook Police Department and demand to speak with Detective Coleman's supervisor. You're going to be the concerned citizen who noticed irregularities in how your case was handled. And when his supervisor asks what kind of irregularities, the president smiled grimly. You're going to tell him that FBI agent Martinez shared some very interesting financial information with you. Information that made you wonder if your case was dismissed because of Detective Coleman's personal relationships rather than lack of evidence. I could see the strategy immediately. Force the local department to choose between protecting Coleman or protecting themselves. Create panic that would drive more mistakes, more desperate communications that federal surveillance could intercept. "What about my safety?" I asked. "Eric is already unstable. If he thinks I'm actively cooperating with federal investigators, you won't be going home after tomorrow's meeting." The president pulled out a tablet, swiping to display official documents. "Emergency witness protection has already been authorized. New identity, new location, full federal security." I stared at the documents, noting my new name, new background, new life. Margaret Ellis, financial consultant from Denver, complete with credit history, employment records, even a social media presence dating back 5 years. "This is very thorough," I murmured. "We've had contingency plans in place since the day you resigned." "Just in case," the admission hung between us. The federal government had been watching me for 3 years, ready to extract me if necessary. It should have felt like surveillance, but instead it felt like the safety net I'd never known I had. "What about prosecutions?" I asked. "Coleman, Eric, Robert Richardson. What happens to them?" "Coleman will flip within 48 hours once he realizes his offshore accounts have been frozen. He'll give us everything about the protection network in exchange for reduced charges." "And Eric?" The president's expression softened slightly. Eric will face federal charges for conspiracy, witness intimidation, and accessory to murder. The woman who died in the car accident, we've reopened that investigation. If we can prove it wasn't accidental, life in prison, I said quietly. At minimum. I thought about Eric sleeping peacefully in our bed, unaware that his world was about to end completely. Part of me, the part that had loved him once, felt something that might have been pity. But then I remembered the other wives, the woman who'd died, all the victims who'd never received justice. What about Robert Richardson? That's where things get complicated. Richardson Development has legitimate contracts worth billions. If we move too aggressively, we risk disrupting critical infrastructure projects, military construction, disaster response capabilities. I understood immediately. You need his cooperation. We need his testimony against the network he created. In exchange for immunity on the federal charges, full disclosure of everyone he's protected, everyone he's paid off, every crime he's covered up. And if he refuses, then we prosecute him for treason. Corrupting federal law enforcement qualifies as an attack on American security. He'll die in federal prison. The president stood, checking his watch. I need your answer, Catherine. Are you willing to be the catalyst that brings down this network? I thought about the woman I'd been 3 years ago. Confident, powerful, unafraid. Then I thought about the woman I'd become. Careful, suspicious, always calculating escape routes. Tomorrow, I would need to be both. Yes, I said, but I want something in return. The president raised an eyebrow. When this is over, when the network is dismantled and the prosecutions are complete, I want my life back. Not Margaret Ellis, not some other fabricated identity. I want to be Catherine Morrison again. Catherine Morrison died 3 years ago when she married Eric Richardson, the president said gently. But if you want to resurrect her, I think we can arrange that. He extended his hand again. Partners? Partners, I agreed, shaking hands with the most powerful man in America while planning the destruction of my husband's life. The drive back to Millbrook took place in pre-dawn darkness, my mind racing through tomorrow's performance. I would need to be vulnerable enough to seem genuine but strong enough to be credible. Scared but determined, the perfect victim finally finding her voice. Eric was still asleep when I slipped back into bed, his breathing heavy with alcohol-induced unconsciousness. I lay beside him in the darkness, listening to the sounds of a man who had no idea he was about to lose everything. At 7 a.m., my secure phone buzzed with final instructions from Agent Martinez. The local police department had been notified of my appointment. Detective Coleman's supervisor, Captain James Walsh, was already asking uncomfortable questions about case closure procedures. Eric stumbled downstairs at 8:30, looking haggard and paranoid. Where were you last night? I woke up and you weren't here. Couldn't sleep, I lied smoothly. I walked around the neighborhood for a while trying to think. Think about what? About what Agent Martinez said. About cooperation and protection. I paused, letting uncertainty color my voice. Eric, I'm scared. He softened immediately, the way abusers do when they sense their control might be slipping. There's nothing to be scared of. This will all blow over. What if it doesn't? What if Detective Coleman really was taking money to protect people? What if that includes you? Eric's face went white. It doesn't include me. Then you won't mind if I talk to his supervisor. Clear the air, show that we have nothing to hide. I can't what? I stood, letting my voice rise slightly. I can't try to protect my husband. I can't show the FBI that we're honest people caught up in someone else's crime. Eric stared at me for a long moment, and I could see the calculation in his eyes. He was trying to determine if my cooperation would help or hurt his position, if my apparent naivety could be used as a shield. Fine, he said finally, but I'm coming with you. The appointment is just for me. Captain Walsh wants to review my case specifically. Then I'll wait in the car. I nodded as if this was reasonable rather than exactly what I'd hoped for. Eric in the police station parking lot when federal agents arrived would create the perfect optics for media coverage. At 10:45 a.m., I walked into the Millbrook Police Department for the second time in a week. This time, instead of being dismissed as a hysterical wife, I was immediately escorted to Captain Walsh's office. Walsh was everything Coleman wasn't. Older, more serious, with the demeanor of someone who'd seen too much corruption in his career. He stood when I entered, extending a firm handshake. "Mrs. Richardson, thank you for coming in." "Please sit down. Thank you, Captain. I appreciate you taking the time to see me." Walsh settled behind his desk, opening a thick file. "I've been reviewing your case, and I have some concerns about how it was handled." "What kind of concerns?" "Detective Coleman closed your case without conducting standard follow-up interviews. He didn't request financial records, didn't interview neighbors, didn't even photograph the evidence you mentioned." I widened my eyes appropriately. "Is that unusual?" "Very unusual, especially for cases involving threats of violence." Walsh leaned forward. "Mrs. Richardson, I need to ask you directly. Did Detective Coleman give you any reason to believe he was personally biased against your case?" The question was perfect, exactly the opening I needed. "Well," I said hesitantly. "He did mention that he and Eric were old friends. He said Eric was a good man who would never really hurt anyone." Walsh made notes on a legal pad. "Did he suggest you were lying about the threats?" "Not exactly lying. More like misunderstanding. He said domestic disputes could get heated and that couples sometimes just needed to work things out." "And how did that make you feel?" I let tears gather in my eyes. Like no one would ever believe me. Like Eric could do anything and his friends would protect him. Walsh's expression hardened. "Mrs. Richardson, has anyone ever suggested to you that reporting your husband's behavior might have negative consequences?" The question was loaded, clearly designed to elicit testimony about intimidation or threats. I could see federal coaching in the careful wording. "Agent Martinez mentioned that Detective Coleman might have financial reasons for dismissing cases," I said quietly. "She said there might be other women who were similarly ignored." Walsh's pen stopped moving. "What kind of financial reasons?" "She mentioned payments from some development company. Richardson Development, I think." I let confusion color my voice. "I don't understand how that connects to Eric, though. We don't have any connection to development companies." "Mrs. Richardson," Walsh said carefully. "Richardson Development is owned by Robert Richardson." "Eric Richardson's uncle," I gasped appropriately. "Uncle Robert?" "But Eric said he doesn't have anything to do with the police department. We're currently investigating that claim." Through Walsh's office window, I could see Eric pacing beside his truck in the parking lot, phone pressed to his ear. Probably calling Robert Richardson, probably panicking about my conversations with police supervisors. "Captain Walsh," I said, "am I in danger?" If Detective Coleman really was protecting Eric somehow, and now there's a federal investigation, you're under federal protection. "Mrs. Richardson, nothing will happen to you." As if summoned by his words, Agent Martinez appeared in the doorway, flanked by two other federal agents. "Captain Walsh, Mrs. Richardson," she nodded to each of us. "We need to accelerate our timeline. We have evidence that suggests Mrs. Richardson may be at immediate risk." Through the window, I watched Eric's phone call become increasingly animated. He was gesturing wildly, his face red with what appeared to be anger or panic. "What kind of risk?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "The kind that requires immediate extraction?" Agent Martinez replied grimly. "Mrs. Richardson, you're coming with us. Now." As federal agents surrounded me, escorting me toward a side exit, I caught one last glimpse of Eric through the window. He was running toward the police station entrance, his face twisted with fury and desperation. But he was too late. By the time he burst through the doors, demanding to know where his wife had gone, I was already in the back of a federal vehicle, speeding toward a new life and a new identity. The last phase of my revenge was about to begin, and Eric Richardson was about to learn what it felt like to be truly powerless. Behind us, Millbrook Police Department erupted into controlled chaos as federal agents executed the final stage of their operation. Detective Coleman was arrested in the parking lot. Captain Walsh was handed federal warrants for a dozen officers. And Eric Richardson was left standing in the lobby, screaming questions no one would answer. The web had finally collapsed completely. And I was the only one who knew that the spider had been pulling the strings all along. 6 months later, I sat in a federal courthouse in Richmond, watching Eric Richardson shuffle into the witness box wearing orange prison scrubs and shackles. The man who had once commanded every room he entered now looked hollow, broken by months of solitary confinement and the growing realization that his entire world had been built on lies. Margaret Ellis had served her purpose and been quietly retired. I was Catherine Morrison again, sitting in the gallery as a federal witness. My real identity sealed under court order, but my testimony crucial to dismantling what prosecutors were calling the most extensive corruption network in Virginia history. Eric's lawyer, a tired-looking public defender who'd replaced the expensive attorneys Robert Richardson could no longer afford, was making his opening statement. The jury listened with expressions ranging from disgust to fascination as the full scope of the conspiracy was laid out. Ladies and gentlemen, my client is not a criminal mastermind. Eric Richardson is a victim of his uncle's manipulation, a simple contractor who became entangled in a web of corruption he never fully understood. I almost smiled at the irony. Even now, Eric was being portrayed as someone else's victim. The prosecuting attorney, Sarah Chen, no relation to David, stood to deliver the government's opening statement. She was someone I'd recommended for the case, knowing her reputation for methodical destruction of criminal enterprises. The evidence will show that Eric Richardson was not a victim, but an active participant in a conspiracy that silenced domestic violence victims, corrupted law enforcement, and protected criminals with the right connections. He didn't stumble into this network, he helped build it. Chen pressed a button, and the courtroom's monitors displayed a timeline that began 3 years earlier. The defendant's pattern of violence escalated after his marriage to Catherine Morrison, a former federal policy advisor who posed a unique threat to the Richardson family's criminal enterprise. The timeline showed police reports that had been buried, hospital visits that had been explained away, and most damning of all, recorded conversations between Eric and Detective Coleman discussing the Morrison problem. The defendant knew exactly who he had married, Chen continued. He knew her background, her connections, her potential to expose their operation. His abuse wasn't random violence. It was calculated intimidation designed to keep a federal witness silent. As Chen spoke, I watched Eric's reaction. His face cycled through emotions, shame, anger, and something that might have been relief. The weight of his secrets had been crushing him for months, and part of him seemed almost grateful that the truth was finally being told. The first witness was Detective Marcus Coleman, who had indeed flipped within 48 hours of his arrest. Coleman looked even worse than Eric, his police pension gone, his reputation destroyed, his gambling debts now the least of his problems. "Detective Coleman," Chen began, "how long have you known Eric Richardson?" "Since high school, about 20 years. "And how would you describe your relationship?" Coleman's voice was barely audible. "We were friends. Close friends." "Close enough? That you would ignore evidence of domestic violence?" "Objection," Eric's lawyer called weakly. "Overruled," Judge Harrison replied. "Answer the question, Detective." Coleman looked directly at Eric for the first time since entering the courtroom. "Close enough that I made the worst mistake of my career. Multiple times." Chen displayed financial records on the courtroom monitors. "Detective Coleman, can you identify these bank deposits?" "Those are payments I received from Richardson Development Corporation." "For what services?" "For making problems go away. Cases that might embarrass the family, complaints that might hurt their business interests." "How many cases did you bury, Detective?" Coleman's voice cracked. 14 domestic violence cases over 3 years, all involving either Richardson employees or family friends. The courtroom was completely silent. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, staring at Coleman in horror. "Detective Coleman, what happened to the victims in these cases?" "Most moved away after their cases were closed. 2 filed for divorce and relocated out of state." Coleman paused, looking sick. One died in what was ruled an accidental car crash. Linda Hawthorne? Yes. Were you involved in the investigation of Ms. Hawthorne's death? I was the lead investigator. And what did your investigation conclude? Coleman's shoulders sagged. That she lost control of her vehicle during a storm and crashed into a tree. Accidental death. But that wasn't the truth, was it? No. Coleman's voice was barely a whisper. Linda had called me the day before she died. She said she had evidence that her husband was stealing from his company, that she was going to take it to federal authorities if I didn't reopen her domestic violence case. What did you do? I told Robert Richardson about the call. Chen let that admission hang in the air for several seconds before continuing. What happened next? Linda's car was found the next morning. The crash scene had been altered. Brake lines cut, steering compromised. But my report listed it as driver error during severe weather. The jury was staring at Coleman with undisguised revulsion. Several jurors were taking notes, but most were simply watching a man confess to covering up murder. Detective Coleman, did Eric Richardson know about Linda Hawthorne's murder? Coleman looked at Eric again, his expression apologetic. He attended the planning meeting. He suggested the storm would provide good cover for the accident. Eric's face went white. His lawyer was frantically scribbling notes, probably calculating whether a plea deal was still possible. Chen continued, her methodical destruction for another hour, walking Coleman through each buried case, each payoff, each act of corruption. By the time she finished, the jury looked like they wanted to convict everyone in the Richardson family tree. The afternoon brought Robert Richardson himself, the architect of the entire network. He'd agreed to testify in exchange for a reduced sentence. Though his cooperation hadn't saved him from federal prison, the once powerful developer looked fragile in his federal custody uniform, his empire reduced to rubble. Mr. Richardson, Chen began, how long have you been bribing law enforcement officers? Approximately 15 years, starting small-scale in Norfolk and expanding throughout Virginia. Why did you start bribing police officers? Real estate development involves numerous regulatory interactions. Building inspectors, zoning officials, environmental agencies. Sometimes projects required. Flexibility in regulatory interpretation. You mean breaking the law? Yes. Chen displayed organizational charts that federal forensic accountants had compiled. Mr. Richardson, can you walk the jury through your corruption network? For the next 2 hours, Robert Richardson methodically destroyed lives and careers, naming names and detailing payoffs. City councilmen, county commissioners, federal inspectors, even 2 state senators, all part of a network that had operated with impunity for over a decade. Mr. Richardson, when did domestic violence cases become part of your operation? About 8 years ago. We had an employee whose wife was making allegations about his conduct. The case threatened a major federal contract, so I arranged for local authorities to minimize the investigation. The case was dismissed? Yes, and the contract proceeded without complications. Did you see this as a successful business model? Yes. Domestic issues were often more manageable than regulatory problems, and the same network that handled building permits could handle family disputes. Robert Richardson's testimony revealed the cold calculation behind years of suffering. Domestic violence wasn't a crime to be prevented, it was a business problem to be managed. Mr. Richardson, how did your nephew Eric become involved in this network? Eric's construction business was struggling. He had cash flow problems, employee issues, and his marriage was creating complications. What kind of complications? His wife was Catherine Morrison, a former federal policy advisor with extensive connections in law enforcement and prosecution. She posed a significant risk to our operations. So you decided to neutralize that risk? We decided to manage it. Eric's domestic issues provided an opportunity to test our network's effectiveness against federal-level threats. Chen turned to face the jury. You used Eric Richardson's abuse of his wife as a test case for silencing federal witnesses? Yes. The courtroom erupted. Judge Harrison gavelled for order, but the damage was done. The jury had heard Robert Richardson admit that my abuse was part of a calculated plan to corrupt federal justice. When the chaos settled, Chen had one final question. "Mr. Richardson, do you have any remorse for what you've done?" Robert Richardson was quiet for a long moment, staring at his nephew in the defendant's chair. "I regret involving Eric. He wasn't built for this kind of life." "What about your victims? Linda Hawthorne, Catherine Morrison, the dozens of women your network silenced?" "I regret that business required such measures." Even his lawyer looked disgusted. The trial continued for 3 more days, but the outcome was never in doubt. The federal government had built an airtight case, supported by recordings, financial records, and testimony from conspirators eager to reduce their own sentences. On the final day, Eric's lawyer called him to testify in his own defense. It was a desperate move, but they had nothing else left. Eric took the witness stand looking older than his years, his confidence permanently shattered. His lawyer led him through a carefully prepared statement about manipulation and coercion, trying to portray him as another victim of his uncle's schemes. But when Sarah Chen stood for cross-examination, the facade crumbled immediately. "Mr. Richardson, you testified that you were manipulated by your uncle. But you married Catherine Morrison knowing exactly who she was, didn't you?" "I knew she worked in Washington. You knew she was senior policy advisor to the President of the United States." "Yes." "You knew she had written federal legislation targeting domestic violence?" "Yes." "You knew she had connections throughout federal law enforcement?" "Yes." "And, despite knowing all this, you chose to physically abuse her." Eric's lawyer objected, but Judge Harrison overruled him. "Answer the question, Mr. Richardson." "I never meant to hurt her. You threw a vase at her head, resulting in a concussion that required emergency room treatment. That was an accident." Chen displayed photographs of my injuries, medical records, and hospital reports. "Were these accidents too?" Eric stared at the evidence of his violence displayed on monitors throughout the courtroom. "I was under a lot of pressure." "Pressure? From your uncle to silence a federal witness through intimidation and violence?" "Yes. So you admit that your abuse was calculated, not accidental?" Eric looked at his lawyer, who was shaking his head frantically, then at his uncle in the gallery, who was staring at the floor. Finally, he looked at me. "Kat," he said, his voice breaking, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for everything." The apology hung in the air like a final admission of guilt. His lawyer was probably calculating whether there was any point in continuing the defense. Chen pressed her advantage. "Mr. Richardson, Linda Hawthorne died because she threatened to expose your family's crimes. Did you feel any responsibility for her death?" "Objection. Overruled." Eric was crying now, the weight of 3 years of secrets finally crushing him. "I didn't want anyone to die. I just wanted the problems to go away. Problems like your wife's federal connections? Problems like everything falling apart. So you participated in a conspiracy to murder Linda Hawthorne." "I never said murder." "You attended the planning meeting. You suggested using a storm for cover. You helped coordinate the timing of her death." Eric was sobbing openly now. "I didn't think they would actually kill her. I thought they would just scare her, make her move away like the others." The admission reverberated through the courtroom. Eric Richardson had just confessed to conspiracy in Linda Hawthorne's murder. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood to read verdicts that would echo through Virginia's political establishment for years. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of witness intimidation, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of domestic violence, we find the defendant guilty. The verdicts continued for 20 minutes. Each one another nail in the coffin of the Richardson family's criminal empire. Judge Harrison scheduled sentencing for the following month, but the outcome was predetermined. Eric Richardson would spend the rest of his life in federal prison. His uncle would die behind bars. and Detective Coleman would serve 15 years for his role in the conspiracy. As federal marshals led Eric away in shackles, he turned to look at me one last time. In his eyes, I saw something I'd never expected: gratitude. The weight of his secrets had been destroying him, and despite everything, he seemed relieved that the truth was finally known. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded Sarah Chen and the federal prosecutors, demanding statements about what media were calling the biggest corruption scandal in Virginia history. 14 police officers had been arrested, 6 county officials indicted, and 2 members of Congress were facing ethics investigations. I slipped away from the chaos, walking to a small park where David Chen was waiting on a bench. "How do you feel?" he asked as I sat down beside him. I considered the question carefully. Like justice was finally served. Not just for me, but for Linda Hawthorne and all the others who never got their day in court. "The president wants to meet with you next week. He's considering a formal role in the new corruption task force." I smiled, thinking about the woman I'd been 3 years ago and the woman I'd become. "Tell him I'm interested. But I want to start with state-level reforms. Make sure this can never happen again." David nodded, understanding immediately. Federal oversight of local law enforcement, mandatory reporting of dismissed domestic violence cases, financial transparency requirements for police departments, and victim advocacy programs with direct federal funding. No more letting local politics determine who gets justice. As we sat in the afternoon sun, I reflected on the past 6 months of trials and testimony. Eric was right about one thing. I had been the smartest woman he'd ever met. But he'd never understood that intelligence without integrity was just manipulation. The real victory wasn't in his conviction or his uncle's imprisonment. The real victory was in the systematic changes that would protect future victims, the new protocols that would prevent corruption, and the knowledge that no one would ever again dismiss a domestic violence case because of political connections. My phone buzzed with a text from Agent Martinez. "Congressional hearing next week. They want your testimony on federal domestic violence legislation. Ready to get back to work?" I looked up at the courthouse where justice had finally been served, then at the city beyond where new protections were already being implemented. "Ready," I typed back. After all, the best revenge isn't just about punishing the guilty. It's about building a system where their crimes become impossible to commit or conceal. And that work was just beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out! And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.